Hello, students. It's Professor Del Russo again, and we are wrapping up Chapter 4 in Professor Poole's text. We spent a lot of time talking about the ground rules, and we're going to wrap up with the last two. One of them, and Professor Poole doesn't spend a lot of time on this, I like to emphasize it in class, and I'll emphasize it a little bit now. It's particularly relevant and effective with small children, and that is the ignorant interviewer instruction. The ignorant interviewer instruction. And basically what that means is we tell the child that we don't know what happened to them. We don't know what's going on in their lives. We don't know anything about what goes on in their lives. We don't know anything about what they've experienced. We don't know anything about anything. The ignorant interviewer. And part of the rationale for that instruction is that children often assume that the interviewer knows everything about their lives. We talked about this during our class sessions, the notion of cognitive egocentricity. Now, Professor Poole points out that there is some research that says it's effective with 5-year-olds in that age range. And the older kids around 8 or 9, it wasn't so effective based upon the research. And Professor Poole suggests that the older kids, the 8-year-olds, they are less likely to believe that the adults know everything. That's something that involves little kids and cognitive egocentricity. So moving on to the most important, perhaps, of the ground rules, although they're all important. But this one is vital, and that is narrative practice. Over here, you'll see a list of support for narrative practice by the National Children's Advocacy Centers. And I'm going to go over that with you paragraph by paragraph, and then I'll explain what they mean by that. So let's take a look at narrative practice. Narrative practice research demonstrates that using narrative practice, including narrative practice in a forensic interview, improves the quantity and quality of information. That is, the outcomes are better. You get better information from kids and you get more of it. Narrative practice also helps to inform and prepare the child for the forensic interview. And it also helps them prepare for this unique style of interviewing, where they're going to be doing most of the talking and you're going to be doing a lot of listening. It allows the child an opportunity to describe a non-abusive event in their own words, while the interviewer pulls for or queries the child about detail. The interviewer employs what are called facilitative responses. These facilitative responses and narrative prompts and narrative invitations help get the child to provide information and thus provide a model for the forensic interview. So when we learn about some non-abusive event in their life, my favorite example is that of ziplining. We want to identify, usually in the intake with the non-offending caregiver or whoever brought the child to the advocacy center, we want to get some event that the child experienced recently. And for example, if it's ziplining, if the child went ziplining recently, well, you get in a little harness and you zoom on a wire from point A to point B. It's a thrill ride. And it's very experiential and it's very sensory. That's why I like it. So imagine a child went on a zipline ride. And you know that because the mother told you that before the interview. Well, you want to bring that up so you can practice with the child. And what are we practicing? The child's ability to provide a narrative. And we're going to ask the child about that zipline experience. We're going to get them to express themselves in words and express details. And we're also going to pull for, we're going to prompt for, we're going to facilitate sensory details. We want the child to get used to what it's like to provide a narrative where they do most of the talking and where the interviewer does little talking and asks questions about details and things that they remember that they have to provide with some degree of precision. And what's great about the zipline is it's experiential. That is, they're involved in doing something. They're on the zipline. It's sensory in that the wind is blowing past them. They might be getting hit by bugs. They're strapped into a harness and kind of a leather harness, and they're flying through the air. They have to get online before they get on. They have to get off with the help of the person who works at the place. There's a lot of sensory detail in a zip line experience. Now, you're not always going to get a zip line, but you want to pull, you want to question them about something that's experiential and sensory, not something that's passive. A child says they went to see Spider-Man is not good. That's a passive experience where they're simply watching something. You don't even want to ask them about something that usually happens a certain way. For example, if they say they like football and you ask them, well, how do you play football? I don't know how to play football. What do you do when you play football? What you're going to get is how it usually happens. You want to try to get a discrete incident where they participated. If you're going to talk about football, you want to hear about the championship game, not generally about football. You want to hear about the championship game, something that's memorable and discrete and separate. You'll see when you look at forensic interview specialist Giselle Enriquez's sample in this learning module that she has a child describe baking cookies. That's a beautiful one. It's almost as good as the zip line. And the reason is because that child did something that was memorable. It happened a little while ago, a few days back. She was a participant, not an observer. She wasn't passive. Her and her sister made cookies. They opened the dough. They separated the dough. They preheated the oven. They put the cookies in the oven. It had smells. It had texture. You could touch the cookies. You can feel what it's like. You had to pull them apart. It's a beautiful example, and Giselle does an excellent job. And you'll see that the kinds of questions that Giselle asks and the kinds of questions that should be asked in narrative practice are questions about detail, about senses, about chronology, what happens first, what happened next. Tell me more about that. Tell me what happened last. Tell me what it felt like. These are the kinds of things that could be asked in a zipline experience or baking cookie experience, and also in a forensic interview inquiry about sexual abuse. It provides the child with information and a foundation for discussing the abuse scenario later on in the interview. So take a look over here. Take a look at this in detail. This is not among your readings, but you can see it right here. Pause it if you have to. Take a look at the National Children's Advocacy Center support for narrative practice. And that concludes Chapter 4 of Professor Poole's Interviewing Children, the Science of Forensic Interviewing.